It's an honor talking with you two gentlemen. I'm a little shocked that I heard that Genesis teaches that there's a steel dome over the universe, over the earth. That is embarrassing. I have read the Bible many, many times over the past 60 years. I can promise you there is no science anywhere in the Bible. Science is a discussion of process, how an organism works. There is absolutely no biology, no chemistry, no physics, no geology, no astronomy anywhere in the Bible. And if someone insists that there is, I think that they have an incredibly wooden interpretation of a book, and that's scary. Secondly, there are problems in the New Testament. There are problems in the Old Testament textually, but I can promise you, it is totally plausible for two thieves nailed to crosses on either side of Christ to heap insults on him, and then for one of them to have a change of heart, a change of mind. There is absolutely no contradiction. There are different perspectives, yes. There's a difference, especially when it comes to the dating of exactly when the Passover occurred, and that's because there's a difference between the interpretation of dating in Galilee versus that in Judea. And it's a well-known fact that they disagreed. They had different interpretations. So to be all psyched out about different interpretations of exactly when the Passover occurred, I'm afraid is a type of hyper-skepticism that if you applied that to all of reality would lead you to be a very lonely, very isolated person. So I'm very unimpressed. I'm also very unimpressed because it's very easy to sit back and take pot shots at different people, a different philosophy, a different religion. But tonight, you put your head on your pillow, and I put my head on my pillow. And like it or not, you're going to have a worldview. I'm going to have a worldview. And Jesus Christ, I have said, is by far the most reasonable, credible, plausible explanation of who God is, of how we are to live our life, the whole dilemma of evil in this world combined with tremendous goodness. And to listen to some people, I won't name names, but to listen to some people use the moral argument to object to animals being hurt in this life and to prey upon people's emotional appreciation of animal life, and then to try and use a moral argument that therefore there is no God, that is absolutely ludicrous. Because if there is no God, morality is relative. So what's wrong with animals dying? And obviously the Bible never says that animals suffer because of human sin. Never once does the Bible say that. Instead, we read that there was a rebellion against God that the angel Lucifer led. There was also rebellion against God in Adam and Eve. So to come down once again so precisely on these points and act like the Bible says this and the Bible teaches that, I begin to think, good gracious, what Bible have you been reading? What are your means of interpreting a text? And if you're going to be overly wooden, it's just as ridiculous to say, well, when Jesus says, I am the vine, he's claiming to be a plant. You've got to allow an author and a speaker to use metaphor, simile, allegory. And these arguments are really hyper-skepticism that's straining at a gnat and missing the whole point. And I think
what is it that we quoted?
Sorry, can I just
analogy?
I just listed them.
Okay, I just want to interrupt here because the idea of the firmament as a solid dome is well established. I mean, even St. Augustine, let me quote you from here.
So what?
He said, hang on, let me finish, Cliff. Let me just read the quote.
He's not the Bible. St. Augustine
No,
is
I know.
Martin Luther's Martin Luther. Well,
Okay.
I'm using arguments.
Sorry,
I'm not
can I
hot shots at each.
Sure.
Okay? I'm listening to arguments and then responding. Please do the same.
Just we'll listen the same. We'll give about maybe 2 minutes to Phil. I promise we'll come right back.
Okay. So there's good reasons to think that the ancient people believed that the sky was solid. All right.
Yes.
The quote from Augustine, I'll read it anyway. I know you don't care, but he said, bear in mind, the term the firmament does not compel us to imagine a stationary heaven. We may understand this name as given to indicate not that it is motionless, but that it is solid, and it constitutes an impassable boundary between the waters above and the waters below. Now, this is found in Sumerian culture as well. They had a solid dome separating waters. The Bible in other places says that it separates the water, so it's doing something. This is I do accept that there can be poetry in the Bible. I'm not saying there can't be, but in this particular case, they actually explain what the firmament does. right? The rabbis, the Talmudic rabbis, debated how thick it was, right? So this is a very commonly held belief. So I don't think you can just be so dismissive that these people really believed it, right? So similarly, even the word rakia, it's from the root, which is to beat out a bowl, right? You can interview, people have interviewed other people in nomadic cultures, and they think the sky is a solid dome, right? So this is very, very common in all the surrounding cultures, in nomadic people today. It's there in the word itself, the rakia. People translated it as firmament because they thought it was firm. The rabbis thought this. It's there in the text. In Job, he describes it as being hard as a solid piece of metal. So there's very good reasons to believe that they believed it. Now we can ask the question, what is more likely? That they have this completely false description in the Bible, one, because they didn't know any better, it's written by humans, it's an invention of humans, or two, that is coming from the God who knows the complete description of the universe. Now, you said, when I come to your other point, that science just describes process. That's just wrong, right? Science also gives us an account of origins of things. It describes the nature of the universe. Cosmology is the science that studies the origins, the content, and the fate of the universe. Now, astronomy also describes what the heavenly bodies are. So the fact that it says there's a firmament is a scientific statement. The fact that it says that there was a global flood is a geological statement. And if you speak to geologists, they'll tell you there was no global flood. So you can't say this Bible doesn't have any science in it. It describes the nature of the universe, the history of humanity, the history of the earth, and it just gets it wrong. So the question is, why does it get it wrong? What's the best explanation for that? The most simplest explanation is that the God of the Bible is fictitious.
I think that is scarily intellectually dishonest. There's absolutely no description of the process that God used to create. And just because Galileo contradicted the accepted Roman Catholic understanding that the Earth was the center of the solar system tells you nothing about what the Bible says. It was a contradiction of how the Catholic Church interpreted the Bible and how Galileo did good science. And Galileo did a tremendous job in science and in interpreting the Bible. Galileo said, the Bible does not tell us how the heavens go. The Bible does tell us how to go to heaven. And you are mixing areas of knowledge. Science is not in the Bible. And just because Sumerian and Babylonian cultures believed in a steel dome, and just because a lot of the Jewish rabbis believed in a steel dome, does not mean that the Bible is teaching that there is a steel dome over the earth. That is so dishonest, it's scary. That is...
It's not steel. It's not... the point is that it says so. I agree. The fact...
No, it doesn't say that.
It does. It absolutely
Then show me where
does.
it says that. It is not saying that. That is your interpretation, and it's a false interpretation. It's adding where the text is silent, and that's intellectually dishonest. If I read the Quran and I add to the Quran, that's intellectually dishonest. I need to study the Quran and quote the Quran. But if I'm going to add to the Quran and then take a pot shot at Islam because of my addition to the Quran, that is so intellectually dishonest, it's scary.
Can I ask a question? Firstly, I think even if Phil is wrong here, I would not hasten to charge him with dishonesty. I think that he believes what he's saying to a T. You would just
statement about him choosing to be dishonest. The thinking is honest.
You were just talking about adding something to the Quran. I have, I guess, two questions that I want to ask you, Cliffe. The first is this: do you agree with the scholarly consensus of biblical scholarship, that is, that both the long ending of the Gospel of Mark and also the story of the adulterous woman in John's Gospel were added later than the earliest manuscripts, were later interpolations of the text?
Due to the precise nature of the manuscript evidence from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there is serious question whether the end of Mark chapter 16 was an addition or whether it was part of the original writing. The same is true for John chapter 7, the end of 7, and the first 11 verses of John 8. There is serious question due to the fact that those passages are not found in the earliest Greek manuscripts that we have, whether those additions or not. Now, Alex, please answer the question. What is more reasonable than the God of the New Testament? Who or what do you put your faith in that is based on more evidence of reliability?
We're getting to this point of reliability because I don't want to just change the subject here. You didn't answer my question.
Alex, you asked a lot of questions. Now, could you please?
Yeah, but you didn't answer my question.
Yes, I did.
Do you believe that they were later additions or not?
I don't know, but there's solid evidence that those were possibly additions. I don't know.
Okay. In which case, because we have to follow the thread of the argument here, otherwise it's a useless endeavor. If we have good evidence to suggest that people were adding stories into the gospel manuscripts even after they were first published, do we not have good reason to therefore think that people could also add stories to these manuscripts before they were written? In other words, that there are all kinds of things that end up in the gospel manuscripts that did not actually happen and weren't in the earliest of traditions.
Historically, that would make zero sense because of the earliest church and how close the events themselves were reported through oral eyewitness testimony, not oral tradition. It was spread throughout the entire universal church and was being preached not just by pastors who were looking for nickels and noses. It was preached by the common people. And so to say that there were early additions is such a leap of faith. It's scary just because potentially there was later additions. I don't think that follows.
Maybe Jesus did, Alex. Maybe Jesus was just a cosmic hoax. It's possible.
I think Jesus existed.
It's possible. The question is not what is ultimately possible. The question is, what does the evidence point to as most reasonable, most reliable in light of the evidence that we do have?
That's right. Do you think that outside of the people that Jesus and the apostles and the prophets of the Old Testament rose from the dead themselves, do you think that Jesus is the only person who's ever risen from the dead?
No, Jesus raised people from the dead.
No, outside of the people that Jesus rose from the dead and the apostles and the Old Testament prophets rose from the dead.
It's totally possible that there is some type of near-death experience or some type
No, I mean like bodily resurrection of the dead.
I am not intelligent enough to follow all of the claims, but the resurrection of Christ, I think, is historically validated in a very intellectually satisfying manner.
So here's a question. In Matthew chapter 27, we're told that there's an earthquake, the second earthquake of Matthew, neither of which we have any other reports of, but there's an earthquake and the graves open and the holy ones of Jerusalem exit their graves and walk around the city of Jerusalem, appearing to many. Do you think that happened?
Yes, I do think that happened. Now, Alex, it's time for you to answer my question. What is the alternative to the biblical God, Jesus Christ, that you accept as more reliable? And secondly, what's the evidence that that alternative to Christ is really reliable?
I'm an agnostic. I don't submit to know what the ultimate answers to human existence are, but I don't think that the evidence for Christianity being the correct one is plausible.
So give me the more plausible one. That was my question, Alex. What's the more plausible one that you have chosen to follow? Because obviously you're dressed a certain way. Obviously you have your hair on your face manicured very nicely. So obviously you have motives, you have ambitions. Mm-hmm. So you're living for something or someone. What is it, and what's the evidence that what you are living for is reliable?
I'm afraid I kind of just reject the grammar of the question. I don't have a systematized theology because I don't even believe in the existence of God. I'm an agnostic. Like I say, I don't know the answer to these questions. I don't know what my ultimate motivations are. I don't even have access to my own sort of deepest psychology. So I couldn't tell you why it is that I shaved my mustache and regrew a beard. I don't know, but I know that it's not because of a man who I don't even believe claimed to be God in the first place, allegedly dying on a cross and leaving some scanty evidence behind him.
I don't think that's fair. You are far too articulate. You are far too deep a thinker to convince me that there's not something that's powerfully motivating you. You're living for something, for someone, for some worldview, some philosophies, religion, whatever. Come on, sir. You are not just an accident. You didn't just arrive at where you are now by chance. You know that as well as I do.
I don't know that. I mean, that's to beg the question. That's precisely the kind of thing that we're trying to discuss here. I don't know how many times I can tell you I'm an agnostic. I don't know how we got here. I don't know how the universe began. I don't know if there's a God. What I do know is that the textual evidence for things like the resurrection in the New Testament is simply not enough to convince me. For example,
what is enough to convince you that whatever you're living for is true?
I don't know. But for example, the reason I brought up the raising of the dead in Matthew chapter 27 is because look, this is an argument from silence, but some arguments from silence work. And if you'll allow me to finish this point, you agree that the most extraordinary event in human history was recorded in the Gospel of Matthew. That is that numerous people rose from the dead, walked around the city of Jerusalem, and were seen by many witnesses. That's what we're told. Interestingly, the text is a little unclear because it says that at the time of Jesus's death, the graves opened, and then they appeared to people after the resurrection, implying that there's this 3-day period where they're either laying around in empty graves or hidden somehow. It seems like a bit of a confused text. Now, again, one hypothesis is that this actually happened, and for some reason they were, I guess, like maybe still dead in their graves for 3 days and then they got up or something. And that this is, although, like I say, the most extraordinary event that's ever happened in the history of our species and seen by many people, recorded in the Gospel of Matthew in one passing sentence, but is not mentioned in Mark or Luke or John. It's not mentioned in Josephus. It's not mentioned in Acts. It's not mentioned in any other historical source. People will say this is an argument from silence. Somebody said to me recently, oh, we don't have any written sources of the destruction of Pompeii either. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. Sure, but imagine that we had numerous sources writing about the city of Pompeii at the time that it was destroyed by a volcanic eruption that didn't mention the volcano. They were writing about Pompeii at the time it's supposed to have happened, and they don't mention the eruption. That would be incredibly strange and suspect and make me think that we couldn't trust our source. So one hypothesis is that this actually happened, and for some inexplicable reason, it is just complete radio silence on all of our historical sources. Or it didn't happen and was an invention of Matthew in order to do something like fulfill the prophecy of the apocalyptic Jesus, that soon there would be a general resurrection of the dead. Why is it that when Jesus dies, the graves open, but it's not until after the resurrection that they start appearing to people? Is it because Jesus is supposed to be the firstborn of the dead? Is he supposed to be the first one that's resurrected? I don't know. But like you, Cliffe, I'm asking what is the most plausible historical explanation here? And I just don't think that this event happened in the way that you think it did. And if it did, it's a complete and utter mystery why these other sources do not even get a whisper of it.
Just on the question of
God, there is absolutely no problem with resurrection. If there's no supernatural God, then obviously resurrection doesn't happen. But Alex, I cannot accept the way you weaseled out of my question about what are you living for and what's the evidence that what you are living for is true. Agnosticism is an option when it comes to, do I prefer spaghetti or pasta? Do I prefer beans or broccoli? I'm agnostic, okay? But when it comes to the ethical decisions that you have to make every day, when it comes to, is human life valuable, and if so, why? When it comes to, is there a meaning and purpose to life, or is there not? And when it comes to, is there life after death or not? You have to go to funerals, Alex and Phil, so do I. People die. You're going to die, I'm going to die. And you have to ask the question, is there life after death or not? You can't just say, I'm agnostic, I don't know. You've got to figure out, is despair a logical conclusion, or is there some reason for hope? You cannot be agnostic when it comes to, is human life valuable? Is there a meaning to life? What's the ethical system I'm going to embrace? And when I sit at a funeral, is there any hope of seeing this person again one day, or is there not? You are forced to deal with those questions. And to sit back and say, I'm agnostic about whether I pay my taxes or not, I'm agnostic whether I'm going to support equal housing opportunity or not, is a cop-out. You can't live your life that way. It's impossible. That is the impossibility of agnosticism. And that's why, Alex, I don't think you've honestly answered my question.
So can I just interrupt for a second?
I can try my best here.
I want to come in for a second.
I do want to give you a chance to respond, Alex, and I also know that I want to keep track and mention that, Phil, I know you were wanting to make a point, so I do want to give Alex a quick chance to give a pithy reply, and then we'll go over to you, Phil, before we go back over to Cliffe and Stuart.
It'll take a moment, because I think we can try to wrap this business up. I don't know why Cliffe seems to be under the impression that agnosticism is literally impossible, not just irrational, but impossible. But when it comes to ethical decision, for example, it's well known that amongst my followers that I'm an ethical emotivist. I'm not attached to that position particularly strongly, but it seems to make sense of the way that I interact with the world and the way that I see people doing ethics. I think that ethical propositions are expressions of emotion, and that's kind of the end of it. Now, I could be wrong about that, and you might think that that has disastrous societal consequences, but to imply that it's impossible to adopt that position, to imply that it's impossible to say, I don't know if there is a God or not, I just think is unintelligible, because I do it, lots of people do it. It's not just that you're claiming that it's irrational, but that it's impossible. You say I'm forced to make, I'm forced to, of course I have motivations for my actions. You know, when I do X or Y, especially when it's a so-called moral decision. Of course, I have a motivation, but as an ethical emotivist, I believe that I'm just expressing an emotional state, and that is perhaps a pessimistic conclusion, but that's not to say a false one.
I do want to give you a chance, Phil, and then maybe at the end of your response, Phil, if you were able to redirect us back to, does the biblical God exist per se?
Right. So exactly, this is the topic for our debate. The topic for our debate is not what is the best way to live your life. It could well be the biblical God doesn't exist, but some other God exists. Who knows? It could be deism is true. Maybe James have got it right. That is not the topic for our debate. The topic for our debate is, does the biblical God exist? And I think we provided very good reasons to say that he does not. And I don't think you've addressed, for example, the cruelty to animals in the Bible, in nature. You haven't really given a good, let's just take a specific example, right? In Deuteronomy, we are told that if a town goes around and says, worship another god, you are to kill all of them, including their animals. Now, what justifies that? That's question number one. Now, I want to make a point. Number two, question for Stu. You asked me for the reference about nature, and I found it. Here it is. Leading scientists still reject God. It's 1998, and the paper says, the question of religious belief amongst US scientists has been debated since early in the century. Our latest survey finds that amongst the top natural scientists, disbelief is greater than ever, almost total. Now, if the evidence that you had that the medics at Harvard had a 40% belief in God, if that was a reason, you actually gave that as one of your reasons in your opening statement to believe in God, wouldn't this be a reason not to, right?
Bro, are you kidding me? You keep misquoting me like throughout this debate. And I did not give that in my opening. That was a response. The second response would have been that your idea of atheists coming up with science, check out modern science. Alex himself will tell you who started modern science behind the Galileos, the Keplers.
No. It was the Greeks.
All of your fallacious, like you kept telling me that I was going by certain arguments. You've been misquoting me literally all day. Now, maybe you were quoting Cliffe and just got us mixed up. But now that you're going here as well,
no, Stuart, did you or did you not quote the Harvard medics? Yes or no?
In a response to you.
Okay. Whether it's in a response or an opening, doesn't matter.
That's great.
You did quote them, right?
That you went and found your little statistic, that you researched it during a debate. I'll go research it and I'll send it, my article as well, to you on email. That's fantastic. It doesn't prove a point.
Okay. No, I agree. Okay.
That's the only reason why I'm a little ticked off.
I don't think it's a misquote.
Keep misquoting me, and you keep talking about points that I did not make.
You did make the point about the Harvard medics.
That was secondary. It was secondary. That was not in my opening.
Okay, I accept it wasn't in the opening, but I don't think that's relevant. You made the point. Okay, so let's go back to Deuteronomy then. Okay, well, how is it justified to kill the animals of people that say we shouldn't worship God? Tell me what the justification for that is.
Yeah, sure. Alex said the Bible doesn't talk about animals in heaven. Well, clearly it states that the lion will lay down with the lamb in heaven. So who's to say when ultimately animals are swept up, for example, in a bomb in Iraq? I'm sure some squirrels have been swept up in a bomb. Who's to say that that's not justifiable in any sort of way? When we live in a tremendously broken world, you talked about it yourself earlier, over 90% of the suffering we go through is done by humans. So, no, I'm not going to give you I don't want to say that I don't have a problem with it. Sure, there's some moral feelings that I have where it's, man, God, why do you allow this to happen? But you need to come to the conclusion that the most reluctant atheist across the pond where you guys live, named C.S. Lewis, he had the opposite response as you do right now. He talks about animal as well as human suffering, and his moral outrage towards it shows that there is a moral law, that there is justice ultimately that's objective, and that would be from God. Then secondly, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, the great Pulitzer Prize winning author over here, Annie Dillard. Read it yourself. She came to believe in God and then a Christian as well as this huge atheist because of her moral outrage over what she saw mainly with insects in the swamp behind her house that she studied for over a year, when she saw different forms of insects landing on the backs of frogs and slowly sucking their brains out. She didn't have this response that you and Alex did, which is, oh, there could be no God who would allow something like that to happen. No, she had the opposite response. And she said, my moral outrage leads me to believing that there is moral objectivity out there. I have a real issue with it. If there wasn't, I wouldn't have a big issue with it. It's just, this is how nature operates, and I got to be okay with that. So
These animals,
some of the biggest
aren't...
atheists have come, and I follow what they're saying. That makes sense to me. It checks out.
These animals are not swept up like you described with those squirrels. These animals are killed on the command of God. And as you know, we discussed this at some length in our last conversation in 1 Samuel 15. The best of the livestock are kept alive by Saul. And when he approaches Samuel, Samuel informs him that God has said he regretted he made Saul king. Why did God regret that he made Saul king? Because he kept alive the animals that he was supposed to kill. This is not like there is some kind of natural order which requires a balanced ecosystem which will involve predation and this kind of thing. This is God saying, go into this town, kill the men, kill the women, kill the children and the infants, and kill the animals. And when Saul does not kill the animals and leaves some of them alive, God regrets that he made Saul king. Phil's question, I think, is to explain how this kind of command can be justified. Not animals getting swept up as a foreseen but unintended consequence of the natural order or war, but no, go and kill them. And if you don't kill them all, you're going to be punished for it. Why?
Because you have an omniscient, omnipotent God who controls the entire universe, who we have to allow to judge when he so chooses. And
judge the animals?
Have revulsions in our 21st century mindset, especially you being very white male and me being very white male, in a very secular, very prominent intellectual area of the world, we're going to have a revulsion to it. Now, I'm going to go to your earlier argument, Alex. Go over.
Do you think it's a white male thing to object to the killing of animals?
They're going to say, "Who are you, Alex, to say in your white Western culture that there's such a big issue with this?" The majority of people in those areas of the world would say, of course a God who's big enough, who created you, is allowed to judge in a nasty, brutish, ancient Near Eastern culture. What's the big deal? And so this gets back to the malleability of the Bible, how it lifts up some cultures and then at the same time challenges and convicts other cultures, rather than this just consensus, universalistic, fluffy type of text.
But Stu, let me hang on. I just want to ask you a question, right? Very simple question, right? If torturing animals is not something to make you think maybe the character in the Bible is not the perfect God that you think exists, right? Because it could be there is a perfect God, but it's not the God of the Bible, right? That's possible. Would you concede that?
Anything's possible if I'm an agnostic.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So, right now, if torturing animals is not going to convince you that this God is not perfectly good, if commanding genocide is not going to convince you that this God isn't perfectly good, what would? Tell me what would convince you, actually, the character in this book isn't perfectly good. What would convince you of that?
If he was perfectly good, that he is perfect.
What would convince you that he isn't?
Oh, that he isn't?
Yes.
I would start with the resurrection. I wouldn't go to talking snakes. I wouldn't go to a dome. I would go right to the resurrection, see if Christ really rose from the dead, and then see what he said about the Old Testament and the claims of God. So no, I don't know exactly. I would widen the goalposts like Alex on this one and say,
No.
I think if God destroyed the entire human race and kept the human race dead and there were no human beings out there, well, then we wouldn't know, obviously, if he was so good or bad. But the issue, yet again, is
if he did that, would you think he's bad?
Again, you are being dishonest because you just said that God tortures animals. No, God stopped the torturing of human beings. Look at Moloch, for example, and what was going on with child sacrifice. So he would be considered way better, way more good than what you are stating right here. So there's no torturing of animals.
What happened in the flood? What happened in the flood? What happened in the flood? Did they drown over 40 days and nights? Yes or no?
We don't know exactly.
I thought you're not allowed to not know.
You don't believe the Bible?
I have no idea what that torturing supposedly looked like, or if it was a swift death.
Hold on. Why are you allowed to say you don't know?
I don't know exactly what that looked like, that type of justice. But to say that somehow people were holding little puppies in their hands and slowly killing them, I think that's a pretty weak argument.
Who said that? Who said that? Nobody said that. And also,
Phil just said torturing. He used
Yes,
the word
torturing.
Yes, a
torturing.
flood,
But that doesn't.
flood.
That,
No, no, hang on. The flood is happening over 40 days and nights. Now, in law, waterboarding, where you simulate drowning, is considered a torture. Now, this is actual drowning, done over 40 days and nights. Let's think about this. The weak would die first. The little kittens would die before the adult cats, right? This would be a slow death. It's over 40 days and nights, Stu. Now, also consider this, right? In Joshua, what does God command of the Hebrew armies? He tells them to hough their horses. Do you know what houging a horse is?
What? That's a good question. We are horse people, but you may know more about horses than me.
Okay, to hough a horse, I had to look this up when I read it, is to sever the Achilles tendon of a horse so that it can no longer run, can no longer walk. It's going to die a horrible death. And that is what God commands the Hebrew armies to do. And it's obviously why, we know why, because it's for victory in battle. Now, God could have easily taught them how to use tranquilizers. He could have teleported the horses elsewhere. He could have just put them to sleep for a few hours during the battle. But no, he commanded this torture, right? Now, if that doesn't convince you that this God is not perfectly good, what would?
Well, I just continue to rely on my favorite intellects over there where you guys are. And C.S. Lewis would answer, yes, there's a problem emotionally for me when it comes to this issue, but there's a greater problem for the atheist and agnostic in explaining this type of moral outrage they have over this issue. So we both have problems. I'm not going to say, oh, this is an easy one. And I'm not going to say this is let's just turn it into a page turner. No, there's true issues here, but I defer to C.S. Lewis, and I think Alex should as well, when saying that you still have a bigger issue than me in answering this question when it comes down to where is this ultimate moral outrage coming from? It's just your own subjective opinion.
I would like to know.
Why try and convince me of this with your great moral outrage?
I'm not trying to convince you as a point of morality. I'm trying to convince you of a point of the truth of the Christian doctrine. I'm making a criticism similar to what Lincoln said of slavery. If this is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. I'm not saying that it's wrong. I'm not saying that it's immoral. I haven't used moralized terms. What I'm saying is that it's unexpected on the command of a loving God. C.S. Lewis, of course, has a chapter in The Problem of Pain where he discusses the suffering of animals. You know how he solves the problem? He says that they don't really experience pain. He says that they're in pain, but they don't realize it. This to me is literally a nonsensical statement. I think that actually doesn't make sense. If you want to take that line, if you want to say, well, let's defer to C.S. Lewis, look at what he says on the suffering of animals, and ask yourself if you'd be okay torturing a dog, because ultimately, although they look like they're in pain, they're not really experiencing it in the way that a human is. Also, be careful with your quotes. I mean, earlier, Stuart, you quoted Dostoevsky. You actually quoted one of the characters of Dostoevsky as saying that if God has said everything is permitted. Of course, the first place that this phrase "everything is permitted" actually occurs is in Crime and Punishment. But in this place, it's applied to the extraordinary men, in particular Napoleon, who are willing to sort of step over the moral feeling that most people have because they've given themselves a position of authority that absolves them of the general morality to commit all kinds of criminality, even though it kind of runs against people's intuitions. People like Napoleon, these great figures, are able to step over that, as Dostoevsky or Raskolnikov says. And for those people, everything is permitted. That sounds a lot more like the kind of thing that the Israelites were doing than anything that any atheist has done. Also, Dostoevsky wrote in a letter to one of his friends, and I quote, "If anyone could prove to me that Christ is outside the truth, and the truth really did exclude Christ, I should prefer to stay with Christ and not with the truth." So I agree with you that there are a great many literary greats who have assented to Christianity, but some of them do so on such ludicrous notions as diminishing the idea that animals can feel pain in the way that other human beings can, and others do so explicitly saying that they would do so even if the facts were all against them. I also want to know why it is that when I'm asked about the most fundamental basic question of reality, whether there's a God and what the ultimate meaning of life is, that when I say I don't know, you say that that's an impossible question, that I'm not allowed to have that option available to me. But when we ask you a very direct, simple textual question, do you think this actually happened and why? You're allowed to say you don't know on that much more simple question.
Oh, I don't. Much of the Old Testament, we went over this. Much of the Old Testament, you have to leave room for. Is it historical narrative, like William Lane Craig says, picking up in chapter 11 of Genesis? Or is that more metaphorical? Is that more literal? Is there poetry in Psalms, for example? You have Deborah talking about the stars are coming to fight for the Israelites. Obviously, that's a song, because the next chapter afterwards, chapter 4 and 5, you have clearly that they actually fought themselves. So there was metaphor. So no, I'm not going to take any passage in the Old Testament, and especially in the New Testament, even out of Matthew, one single passage. I think it's greater evidence for reliability in one sense if many were silent on it. I'm not going to build a whole theological position off of one verse or one passage. I'm going to take many together. The Old Testament God left room for 400 years for certain people groups to turn, to change, to show love and humanitarian rights. He welcomed slave girls, prostitutes. He welcomed Canaanites into the kingdom. I mean, look at Rahab, for example, another Gentile prostitute. The type of grace and love, I went over this with you last time we talked about Genesis chapter 12, right out of the gate. He's the one who walks through the dead pieces of animals rather than saying, Abraham, you have to do it, because judgment, it's talking already about in Genesis 11, is going to land on God. That is the best form of sacrifice and love I could ever imagine. The other side is not contradicting himself, but it's showing his holiness.
Can I ask you a question? We've spoken about God inflicting suffering on animals. As it gets a bit complicated, because like you say, the genre of the text is important. There could be room for things like hyperbole, whatever. But the example that I gave in my opening, I said it was a direct question and it hasn't been answered. And that's due to the sake of time, of course, but I want to give you the opportunity now. That deer, leg trapped under a branch on its own, no moral free choice, no moral soul development, no people looking at this with a chance to save them, giving them an ability to achieve some higher order good, just starvation for, say, I don't know, a week before finally being stumbled upon by a mountain lion who will kill it by sticking its jaws in its throat, and it will die excruciatingly over the course of a few minutes. This kind of thing happens routinely throughout the animal kingdom. I said that if I gave you the opportunity right now, if I said that you were about to become a random wild animal somewhere in the world right now, when I press this button, I think you would kill yourself before I had the opportunity, because you know that you're about to enter a life of untold misery. The question is, why? Why is this allowed? And bear in mind that I don't know is not an answer.
Oh, yes, it is an answer. I don't know is called honesty, Alex. And if I don't know...
Well, there we have it then. I agree with you. I don't know is called
I'll
honesty.
give you my best
Agnosticism on this question is called honesty. We don't know. You don't know. I don't know.
Unfair, messed up world. That deer is not born into the Garden of Eden. And because we are born into an unfair, messed up world, I've got a bigger concern than the deer. I've got the concern of my niece who died at the age of 7 in a horrible car wreck. I have a bigger concern, Alex. I have the concern of my nephew who was born with spina bifida. I have a bigger concern, Alex, and that's my younger sister who was born with brain damage and had to go through special ed. We are all born, the deer, the human being, all of us are born into a cursed, unfair world. Not because God created it that way, but because we human beings told God to take a hike, and Lucifer told God to take a hike. And when God steps back, chaos erupts. Now, the real question is there a solution? And the amazing message of the gospel of Jesus Christ is God loves us so much that he provides the ultimate solution, forgiveness and eternal life in heaven, where there will be no more suffering, no more death. Now, what's your solution to the very real problem of animal suffering, of human suffering? And you guys, if you're going to be honest, you know you have no solution other than despair. Because poor suckers get born at the wrong time in the wrong place. It's just fate, destiny, and chance. And why don't you try and be honest about how you have to work through the despair and the meaninglessness of life in light of the fact that there is no God?